There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that does not come from work or lack of sleep. It comes from hoping. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He saw that hope, when it operates beneath awareness, becomes a way the psyche chains itself to outcomes it has no power to control. Empaths feel this chain most sharply. Their gift for feeling is too easily mistaken for a duty to stay, to repair, to keep believing in a transformation that may never arrive. Jung observed that when psychic energy, what he called libido, is poured into people or situations that cannot return or sustain it, a dangerous hollowing begins. What looks like compassion from the outside is often a refusal to see what is actually there. Hope is never neutral. It is a filter. It shapes what we allow ourselves to notice. When someone keeps returning to the same relationship or pattern, waiting for change, they are not merely being patient. They are living out an unconscious fantasy that their presence, their endurance, their care will somehow turn the other person into someone capable of meeting them. Jung named this projection. The empath relates not to the real person in front of them, but to a potential version that does not yet exist, and may never exist. That is not love. It is an investment that empties the investor and enriches no one. The hopeful empath becomes trapped in a one-way circuit. Energy streams outward toward the other, toward the next conversation that might finally shift things, toward the possibility of change. Almost nothing comes back. Jung taught that psychic energy must circulate if vitality is to be maintained. When it flows in only one direction, the personality grows anemic. A fatigue appears that rest cannot touch. Thoughts slow. Ordinary tasks feel heavy. This is not personal failure. It is the psyche sending a clear signal that the distribution of energy has gone wrong. Symptoms are the language of the unconscious. When the conscious mind will not face an imbalance, the unconscious creates its own correction. Burnout is one form. Emotional numbness is another. These states are not character flaws. They are protective withdrawals, the psyche reclaiming energy from a relationship that has become parasitic. At this point, many empaths feel deep guilt. They fear they are abandoning their values or betraying their nature. What is actually happening is that the unconscious has begun the work of individuation by cutting an attachment that was never mutual. Jung noted that people whose primary function is feeling and whose attention is turned toward others are especially prone to self-erasure. They confuse the ability to sense another's emotional state with the responsibility to manage it. Life becomes organized around other people's needs, other people's pain, other people's potential. The empath turns into a container for what others refuse to carry. Boundaries dissolve. They no longer know where their own feelings end and another's begin. They have given away so much inner space that none remains for themselves. The psyche will not tolerate permanent imbalance. If the conscious mind will not correct it, the unconscious forces the correction through symptoms, collapse, or what looks to outsiders like sudden coldness. These are not pathologies. They are the psyche restoring itself, pulling energy back from places it was being wasted and redirecting it inward so the self can be nourished again. When detachment finally comes, it rarely feels like a decision. It feels like waking from a long dream and realizing the room you are standing in is not the room you believed it to be. The empath does not choose to stop caring. One morning the care is simply gone. The hope has evaporated. Where there was once a leaning forward urgency, there is only quiet. That quiet is not bitterness, though it is often misread as such. It is the natural result of energy withdrawing from an object that cannot sustain it. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. The phantom self the empath had been relating to dissolves, and what remains is the actual person, exactly as they have always been. The moment is both devastating and clarifying. Devastating because it means recognizing that years of patience and understanding rested on a misperception. Clarifying because, for the first time, reality appears without the soft distortion of hope. The other person is not going to change. The relationship has been extractive. Energy has been feeding something that gives nothing in return. With that seeing comes a shift. The empath stops leaning forward, stands upright, and returns to their own center. Jung insisted that individuation begins with separation, not connection. The person must withdraw from collective roles, from expectations imposed by others, from the unconscious entanglements that keep them bound to dynamics that do not serve their wholeness. For the empath, this withdrawal feels like betrayal. The identity built on, I am good because I care, valuable because I help, worthy because I stay, begins to crumble. Without that identity, who remains? The psyche demands an answer, and the answer cannot be found in relation to others. It can only be found by turning inward, by sitting with the silence, by allowing the energy that once flowed outward to settle within. Jung described this as a descent into the unconscious, an encounter with what has been neglected. For many empaths, what has been neglected is their own need, their own desire, their own pain. In the stillness after detachment, they are forced to meet what they previously ignored. This meeting is rarely comfortable. The empath who once defined themselves by their capacity to feel for others now notices they feel far less. Sympathy no longer rises automatically. Appeals that once pulled them in no longer move them. Saying no becomes possible without endless inner debate. This is not hardness. It is discernment. The psyche is learning to protect its energy and reserve it for what truly matters. Jung warned that the empathic person often confuses love with self-sacrifice, believing that to love means to endure anything, forgive endlessly, hope forever. That is not love. It is a distortion that serves the empath's unconscious need to avoid their own inner work. By staying focused on fixing the other, they postpone facing the unintegrated parts of themselves, the shadow material they have refused to acknowledge. The shadow holds everything the conscious personality has rejected. For the empath, it often contains aggression, selfishness, the capacity to hurt or walk away. These qualities terrify them because they contradict the identity they have carefully built. Yet Jung was clear. Without integrating the shadow, individuation remains impossible. The person stays one-sided, capable of only half of human experience. The empath who has lived only in the light of care must descend and retrieve the strength, the clarity, and the necessary anger that live in the dark. The descent does not feel noble. It feels confusing and bitter. Thoughts appear that were never allowed before. How much was given, how little was received, how kindness was taken for granted. These realizations hurt, but they are true. And truth, even painful truth, nourishes more than illusion ever could. Jung observed that the psyche moves toward wholeness, not comfort. Individuation is not about becoming a better version of the self according to external standards. It is about becoming a complete self, one that includes both light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, connection and solitude. For the empath, this means accepting that the capacity for care does not create an obligation to care for everyone. It means recognizing that withdrawal can be the most honest response, and that some relationships are not meant to be repaired because the dynamic itself is fundamentally unbalanced. When the empath returns, it is not a return to who they were. Transformation is irreversible. Once energy has been withdrawn and redirected, the old patterns can no longer fully reclaim the person. The empath who comes back after detachment returns with boundaries and clarity. They return by choice, not by hope. That difference changes everything. They no longer pour themselves into relationships indiscriminately. They no longer mistake intensity for intimacy or the ability to feel for the duty to fix. They have learned that their energy is finite and precious, that not everyone deserves access to it, that silence can be more honest than speech, and that leaving can sometimes be more loving than staying. Jung said the individuated person stands alone, not out of isolation, but out of self-possession. They no longer depend on others for their sense of worth. The empath who has detached and returned has begun to taste this self-possession. Projections have been withdrawn. Enough of the shadow has been integrated that strength no longer frightens them. Energy once given away so freely is now held carefully and offered only where it can be received and returned. This does not make the empath cold. It makes them discerning. They still care deeply, but selectively. They give generously, but not recklessly. They love fully, but not blindly. Jung called this psychological maturity, the ability to relate without losing oneself, to remain open without becoming porous, to be compassionate without being consumed. The path is not linear. Old patterns resurface. The pull toward depleting dynamics returns. Yet each time the psyche responds more quickly. Withdrawal becomes more decisive. Boundaries grow firmer. The empath learns to trust the signal of that particular exhaustion, the one that comes not from effort but from hoping, and to treat it as a cue to step back, redirect energy inward, and let detachment do its quiet work. Jung warned that hope can become a moral trap. When a person believes they should keep hoping, that continued belief in someone's potential is inherently virtuous, they are not acting from consciousness. They are acting from an unconscious complex that keeps them bound, even when the bond harms them. The empath who allows hope to dissolve and detachment to take its place is not giving up. They are waking up. They begin to see accurately the limitations, the refusals, the patterns that will not change. Seeing this, they stop fighting reality. They accept what is. In that acceptance, they find freedom. Acceptance is not resignation. It is the clear acknowledgement of reality without the distortion of fantasy. For the empath, it means recognizing that they cannot save everyone, that their care cannot heal every wound, that some people will remain exactly as they are, no matter how much energy is offered. The realization is painful at first. It feels like failure. Yet as the grief moves through, something unexpected appears: lightness. The burden they believed was theirs to carry dissolves because it was never truly theirs. Much of what feels like personal responsibility is actually a projection of earlier patterns, family systems that needed someone to hold everyone's pain, childhood environments that rewarded the child who became the emotional container. The pattern continues long after it has ceased to serve any useful purpose. Breaking it requires consciousness. The empath must ask, is this truly who I am? Or is this who I learned to be in order to survive? The answer is almost always the latter. With that recognition comes the possibility of real change. Detachment creates the space in which change can occur. In that space, the empath can practice new ways of being, saying no, allowing others to sit with their own discomfort, refraining from intervening or soothing. At first, it feels wrong. Guilt rises. But if the guilt can be tolerated without being acted upon, something remarkable is discovered. Nothing catastrophic happens. The other person survives. The world continues. And the empath, having kept their energy, has more available for themselves. This is the quiet revolution of detachment. It does not announce itself. It simply returns energy to the self and restores the balance that was lost. Jung described the self as the organizing center of the psyche. When all energy has been flowing outward, that center becomes eclipsed. The person lives as a satellite orbiting others, never occupying their own orbit. Detachment brings them back. It is not a final destination, but a reorientation, an ongoing process of monitoring where energy is going and whether it is being met. With practice, the vigilance becomes instinctive. The moment a relationship begins to drain, the response is no longer hope but adjustment, a step back, the creation of space, the protection of the center. The individuated person does not avoid relationship. They enter it from wholeness rather than need. The empath who has moved through detachment engages differently. They no longer seek completion or validation through others. They offer connection as a complete self without requiring it to define them. Relationships that were always mutual survive this shift. Those that were extractive dissolve. The dissolution hurts, yet it is necessary. Clinging to what no longer serves individuation is a form of stagnation. What is gained by letting go is the space for relationships that can nourish rather than deplete. The empath who has lived this process knows it in the body. They have felt the relief of withdrawal, the return of vitality, the sharpening of clarity, the solidifying of boundaries. Once known, it cannot be unknown. Hope without reciprocity is self-abandonment. Care without boundaries is a quiet form of self-harm. Staying in what depletes is not noble. It is unconscious. Consciousness is both gift and burden. Seeing clearly how much energy has been spent on what cannot change is painful and liberating. Energy can now be directed toward what is actually present, what is actually possible, what actually sustains life. The return of the empath is therefore not a return to the old self. It is the emergence of a new one that has integrated the lessons of detachment. This self is quieter. It no longer needs to prove its worth through endless care or demonstrate its goodness by tolerating harm. It simply is, centered, whole, offering connection when mutuality is present and withdrawing when it is not. This is what Jung meant by becoming who you truly are, not who you were taught to be, not who others need you to be, but who remains when the projections have been withdrawn and the false hopes have dissolved. Detachment is not bitterness. It is not a closing of the heart. It is a correction, a realignment of psychic energy with the deeper laws Jung described. The empath who detaches has not lost the capacity for compassion. They have gained the capacity for discernment. They have learned that not everything deserves their energy, that not everyone deserves their hope, and that some silences speak more truthfully than any words. In learning this, they become whole.